There has been a lot happening politically around the world and in the United States, and it's fair to say that we're beyond the point of possiblies, and we know that there has been a rise in fascist movement. This rise in fascist ideologies and political movements include white nationalism, authoritarianism, and anti-democratic rhetoric. But it is not something that happens in isolation. It also does not happen without the rise of other things. While we're seeing a rise in fascist ideologies, we are also simultaneously seeing a rise in loneliness. We are facing a loneliness epidemic. Through social isolation, a decline in community ties in third spaces, in addition to mental health crises, these things are also on the rise with fascism, and I'm here to say that is not a mistake or coincidence. These things are interwoven. This video will focus on not only how these two things are connected, but what that means for the state of America and the world moving forward. I'm going to explore this with historical, sociological, economic, and psychological resources and perspectives. As we start this, it's important that we define what fascism is. Fascism is a far-right, ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement. It is an ideology that typically centers around a dictatorial leader, centralized power. It emphasizes and hyperfixates on militarism. The centralized authority in this case would have the ability to forcibly suppress anybody who opposes them. With fascism comes a rise of a belief in a natural social hierarchy. This relies on the subordination of individual interests for the perceived good of a nation or a race of people. In his book, How Fascism Works, Jason Stanley defines fascism as a cult leader who promises national restoration in the face of humiliation brought on by supposed communists, Marxists, and minorities and immigrants who are supposedly posing a threat to the character and the history of a nation. The leader proposes that only he can solve it and that all his political opponents are enemies and traitors. I'll let that one sink in. Fascism relies on a strong focus on the society as a whole and the economy. Fascism, the word, derives from the Italian word fascio, which means a bundle. It also means group and is often used for a militarized group or brotherhood. The word fasces, which fascism also derives from, is a bundle of axes, which became one of the symbols for the fascist movement and specifically was used on a flag for Mussolini, who is the first fascist leader of Italy. It's supposed to symbolize strength and unity. Ironically, it is also built on the premise of othering and separating. Fascism as an ideology rejects the idea that violence is inherently bad, and it ultimately aims for a totalitarian one-party state with the use of that violence. It is not afraid to use violence to get things done. People who are fascists will use violence by any means to accomplish anything they want. January 6th. One key marker for fascism is the focus on an economy that is self-sufficient and separate from the rest of the world. This is contextualized with a hyper-emphasis on authoritarianism, extreme nationalism, and this often manifests in the form of racial purity and things along those lines. It revolves around racism, bigotry, and the demonizing of others and the othering of people as a whole. This can lead to genocides, massacres, forced sterilization, killings, and forced deportations. There's noted to be 12 early warning signs for fascism. Although this list was made by someone who calls themselves an amateur historian, this list is widely popular. A lot of historians and experts agree reading through the patterns recognized with fascist movements in the past. 1. Powerful and continuing nationalism. 2. A disdain for human rights. 3. Identification of enemies as a unifying cause. 4. Rampant sexism. 5. Controlled mass media. 6. An obsession with national security. 7. Government and religion intertwined. 8. Corporate power protected. 9. Labor power suppressed. 10. Disdain for the intellect and the arts. 11. Obsession with crime and punishment. 12. Rampant cronyism and corruption. Please sound off in the comments if you notice any patterns between the past and the present. Speaking of the past, it's important that we acknowledge the roots of fascism. Fascism spawned in the early 20th century following World War I. The aftermath of World War I left a lot of countries in economic distress and political instability, and unfortunately this created fertile ground for radical ideologies. The first fascist movement to form was Benito Mussolini's National Fascist Party in Italy in 1922, promoting anti-communism, militarism, and of course nationalism. Benito Mussolini's fascist party actually inspired Hitler's Nazi party in Germany, which came to power later on in 1933. Nazism emphasized anti-Semitism, extreme nationalism, and racial purity. Some other fascist movements that rose around the world at the time include Japan, Spain, and Romania. Although I will not be giving a crash course on World War II and how that started and ended, I will tell you through the defeat of the Axis powers, which include Germany, Italy, and Japan, at the end of World War II marked the end of the fascist regimes that took hold in Europe around that time. Mussolini was captured and executed by partisans in Italy in 1945, the same year that World War II ended. And after World War II, the Nuremberg trials followed, which held Nazi leaders accountable for their war crimes and further led to the delegitimization of fascism as an ideology, or so you think. The establishment of democratic governments in European unions was put in place to prevent the rise of fascism as well. But the important question, and one that I want to ask today, is how does loneliness pair into that? Before we move on to modern fascism and what it looks like, it is important to contextualize how loneliness played a part in the rise of fascism in the early 20th century. Trust me, it did. For starters, there was social atomization. After World War I, which is before Mussolini or Hitler, many societies experienced the breakdown of traditional social structures and communities. This led to a sense of isolation and loneliness amongst the people. Then there was the economic hardship. The Great Depression and other economic crises further exacerbated feelings of loneliness and despair. People sought a sense of belonging and community, and fascism promised those things to people. Political theorist Hanah Arendt theorizes that loneliness is actually one of the key factors to the rise of totalitarian regimes. She believed that loneliness actually made people more susceptible to these totalitarian ideologies. This is mostly because they crave a sense of belonging and identity. This is made clear even in the tactics that a lot of the fascist leaders used to galvanize their people. Mussolini and Hitler hyper-focused on propaganda, which centered the idea of belonging and unity amongst their followers. They often portrayed themselves as the solution to the fragmentation and loneliness that people were experiencing as a result of both the economy and so many other breakdowns in society. This loneliness led to a lack of trust in other people and in social structures, and a lack of trust in social institutions and your fellow man makes people more susceptible to authoritarian rule where they promise to bring back order and stability. At the end of the day, people want to feel order and stability. And you're a lot less likely to feel lonely when you feel connected to a larger group or a bigger cause, which again, fascism promises for a lot of people. This sense of belonging temporarily alleviates a lot of the mental health struggles that people deal with, including loneliness, but unfortunately it is at the cost of not only their rights, but the rights of other people. Fascism took root because it promised connectivity, a sense of belonging, and not only that, but the relief of not having to struggle economically. We see this in modern day with authoritarianism, nationalism, scapegoating, and anti-democratic rhetoric. Currently in the United States, it is being discussed that we are facing what is called a loneliness epidemic. What is a loneliness epidemic? This is when a large group of people face chronic social isolation and a lack of meaningful connections with other people. 31% of adults in the United States report feeling lonely, often, always, or sometimes. The impact of COVID-19 exacerbated these things. During the lockdowns, a significant number of people reported feeling even more socially isolated than before. Loneliness is particularly prevalent amongst young adults, with 30% of adults between the age of 18 and 34 reporting feeling lonely every day or several days a week. Single adults are more likely to feel lonely than married adults, with 39% of single adults feeling lonely and 22% of married adults feeling lonely. And I want to be clear, it is a public health crisis. Loneliness is a public health crisis. It severely impacts so many aspects in your life, including your health. In fact, in May of 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General declared it officially a public health crisis. Loneliness and social isolation is connected to and associated with things like depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. So your mental health is severely impacted when you experience isolation and loneliness from other people. With the decline of third spaces in social institutions like churches, unions, and social clubs in the United States, it is not a surprise that loneliness has been on the rise. Technology has driven a lot of superficial connections, but that does not necessarily replace or supplement for what meaningful connections can bring to a person's life. Additionally, there's the economic pressures of a rising cost of living without a rise in wages, which means that a work-life balance is pretty much impossible for so many Americans, especially younger Americans. This rise in loneliness in the United States has also been paired, unfortunately, with a rise in fascist ideologies as well. With economic inequality and instability, it has led a lot of people towards a search for answers. There are a number of factors that contribute to the rise of fascism recently in the United States. One of them being income inequality. In 2018, the U.S. Census Bureau reported income inequality reached the highest height it's had in 50 years. The average top 1% of families raised 26.3 times more than the average 99% of families in the United States. But it's not just income, it is also wealth and how it's hoarded in this country too. The top 10% of families held 67% of the total household wealth, averaging $6.9 million per household. In contrast, 50% held 2.5% of total wealth, averaging $51,000 a household. In addition to that, the wealth of the 1% has also increased drastically. Since the 2008 and 2009 housing market crash, the top 1% holds 31% of the entire $159 trillion of national wealth to themselves. The rise of fascism in the United States don't stop at wealth and income. There has been a rampant increase in political polarization and distrust in social institutions. Social media factors in so much in this conversation, and I do not want to discount the role that billionaires have in buying up these social media sites and also helping to radicalize the people on there. Since Elon Musk took over X, formerly known as Twitter, the amount of hate speech on the app has increased drastically. Before, according to a study by Montclair State University, the average amount of hate speech was 84 times per hour. Since he acquired it though, it's gone up to 4,778 per hour. This jump happened within hours of him acquiring the site. Additionally, when it comes to social media, we've seen it orchestrate and lead to incidents like what happened on January 6th with the insurrection, where people stormed the Capitol, and in the growth of and facilitation of these far-right nationalist hate groups. Some of you might be familiar with the Proud Boys, and some of you might be familiar with the Patriot Front. Social isolation and loneliness drive this. I cannot emphasize enough how interconnected these two concepts are. A 2021 study by the Rand Corporation found that half of the people they interviewed who were formerly in extremist groups reported feeling lonely before they joined these groups. I would go as far as saying that their radicalization is tied to how lonely and isolated they felt, the amount of mistrust they had in these social systems and institutions, and that factored into how these people found themselves being radicalized. It is human to desire to feel connected to other people. It's human to desire to be part of a group, to belong, and these fascist movements are preying on people's vulnerability. Am I saying that these people are innocent? No, they know what they're doing. But I do believe it's important to note that as well. History has shown time and time again that charismatic leaders can manipulate the masses through the promise of community. But that brings me to the conclusion, and that is, what do we do about this? First, we have to rebuild community institutions. Third spaces play such a crucial role in the function of our society, and I think with the lessening of third spaces, we are learning more and more how that can breed, and often does breed, the fertile ground that fascism needs to take root. We also have to encourage meaningful in-person connections. Social media is not a substitute for meaningful in real life connections that help people to feel connected to others and not find themselves falling down these pipelines that lead to ultimately far right-leaning extremist ideology. It is also crucial that our government takes note that public policy that invests in the betterment of people's lives, like universal healthcare and universal housing protection, that prevents people from falling into social isolation through economic downturn. One of the ways that we can combat fascism directly on its face, because it is here, preventing it is not an option right now, is to promote media literacy and critical thinking. When we encourage people to challenge the manipulation that is used to recruit people to these far-right ideologies, we are also helping to better our society. In closing, the loneliness epidemic and fascism are so deeply interconnected that addressing one without addressing the other just simply will not work. Public policy, economic equity, challenging bigotry towards marginalized groups of people, All of these things are essential to combating what we're facing right now as a society. I encourage for you to look around and assess who is your community and what you can do for your community. And overall, I encourage you to call out fascist behavior when you see it. That's all for me. Please like, subscribe. Tell me if you like this format for me. I can do more if you want. But yeah, thank you for tuning in.